All right, good morning, everybody. First off, thank you for your patience with me on Monday. My youngest son, Oliver, started throwing up Sunday night and kept throwing up like all night until like 2, and then decided it was time to party. So he didn't sleep at all. And I decided I couldn't come in and teach for fear of getting everybody else sick. Excuse me. So what we're going to do this week is we have chapter 4. This covers civil liberties. And I'm going to lecture today with the first third of it. Then we're going to have a video for the second chunk of it. And then Friday we'll do the last chunk of it. So it's going to be a little bit abridged. But I think that this is a pretty fun one, which is why I wanted to be able to spend some time with you guys on it in person rather than just introducing it with a video. So I want to start off by talking about civil rights and civil liberties. And these two terms are pretty confusing because we have the Bill of Rights, which is where our civil liberties come from, and then we have things like the Civil Rights Act. And a lot of people think of these things interchangeably. I have the right to the freedom of speech. But to people who are studying political science, these two terms mean slightly different things. A civil right is something that's designed to treat people fairly. It's something that's designed to make sure that we're going to treat white people the same as black people, women the same as men, and so on. A civil liberty, however, is what we typically think of when we think of rights. A civil liberty is going to be those things that the government cannot do to you. So for example, when we talk of freedom of speech or freedom of religion, these are going to be your civil liberties. I'm introducing this not because I'm going to test on it or I'm going to like grill you guys about it, because realistically, the distinction is non-existent. If you go and talk to people about their civil liberties, they'll have no idea what you're talking about. If you talk about their civil rights, they'll tell you things like the right to possess a gun. That's the way the world really works. But if you want to go on with political science, I need to at least cover it. I need to have said it to you before we get into it, right? So let's begin talking about this. Like I said, today we're going to cover kind of what the introduction to it and freedom of speech. In your video, you're going to hear me basically going over freedom of religion, privacy and related liberties, and then the due process rights or the rights of the accused. And most of these you can think of in terms of the amendments they come from. So today we're going to do kind of like the first third of the First Amendment. We're going to get through that. And then next class we're going to go through the rest, the second 2/3 of the First Amendment, and then the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. I'll talk to you guys about the Second Amendment because that's a big one, but we'll do that a little bit differently. So please be reading. It's really important that you do that just because I am not going to be able to cover everything in the book, but everything that I talk about in the lecture and that is in the textbook is going to be fair game. Full disclosure, I intend to use the exam banks from the textbook. So it might cover things that I think are really important that are from the reading only. I'm kind of trying to give you the highlights here. So if you have any questions as you're reading or you want anything explained more, feel free to reach out to me or feel free to ask during class. If you're online and you have a question, I will make sure and answer it on the video so that everybody has the benefit of that. All right, we covered that. So from a practical standpoint, who enforces civil liberties? What do you guys think? All right, come on. Somebody needs to be the guinea pig. Volunteer.
Can you repeat the question?
From a practical standpoint, who enforces civil liberties? If we talk about like freedom of speech, who makes sure that you have freedom of speech?
The government.
Sort of. I think that's a good start. Anybody else want to narrow it down a little bit? What part of the government? So civil liberties are a limit on government power. And so from a practical standpoint, the judicial system is going to enforce civil liberties. When we talk a little bit more about the judiciary, we're going to talk about the requirements for the judiciary to act, the justice system. How is it going to act in any given situation? Well, they need an actual case in controversy. Again, we'll go into more about what this means later on, but when we talk about a case in controversy, that means that the courts can't go around looking for problems to fix. They're not proactive. The judicial system is always reactive, meaning that somebody has to have their rights violated, a court case has to be brought, and at that point, the court system is going to act to make sure that those civil liberties are enforced. What does this look like in practice? What this looks like in practice is the government arresting somebody for desecrating the flag or burning it. And they get convicted of this, and then they appeal. And they lose their appeal because the law is sound. You can't burn the American flag. And they appeal again to a higher court, and they lose because the law is sound. And eventually they get to the Supreme Court, who rules that no, burning the flag is part of freedom of speech. That's protected under the First Amendment. The government can't create a law that infringes on your freedom of speech. And therefore, they overturn it all. New law is set. The court enforces the civil liberty, but it's only because the people have challenged it. The people have responded to some government overreach and fought to enforce their rights. So who enforces civil liberties? The judiciary, but I would argue and submit to you guys for your consideration that it's really all of us. We are going to enforce civil liberties by what we're willing to put up with, by what we challenge, and by what we are basically not going to tolerate within the zeitgeist. We talked a couple times ago about how when we first came up with this concept of a right to privacy, again, that would be a civil liberty because it's prohibiting the government from doing things. One of the fundamental cases on that centered on pornography. The culture about whether or not that's acceptable changed throughout American history, from something that was absolutely taboo to something that was a lot less of a problem. And that's going to factor into how we interpret the Constitution, how we are going to respond to different things. Everybody's familiar with what's going on with ICE, right? Is anybody not familiar with what's going on with ICE? Perfect. When we talk about that sort of thing, a lot of accusations are being made, some of them justified, some of them not, about violating people's civil liberties. And the reason I'm talking about all of this, the reason I think it's really important now, is that the way that we act as a society, the things that we're willing to tolerate, are going to shape that entire paradigm of what we deem acceptable. Just like we saw the stance about reproductive rights or what kind of relationship you can have or pornography evolve over time, we can, by what we're tolerating, control, more or less, what's going to happen with things like searches and seizures or Second Amendment rights. So we'll look at the constitutional toolkit for how I want you guys looking at these problems in just a minute. And that's kind of where I want you to go. So we did this chunk. If you want to write this down in your notes, civil liberties are protections from government interference, speech, religion, search, seizures, due process, etc. Civil rights are equal treatment and protection under law, anti-discrimination, voting rights, equal protection. Everyone's heard of the Civil Rights Act. That's a great example. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a great example of a civil right. The Voter Rights Act is a great example of civil rights. It doesn't say the government can't do this thing the way that a civil liberty does. What it does say is that in these things that the government is doing, or in these things that private individuals are doing, we have to treat people the same. All right. I talked last time about how the Bill of Rights does not originally apply to the states. When we first create the Constitution, when we first have these amendments, we have these, we didn't have 50 back then, but we had each state as a microcosm of democracy. They could do whatever they wanted. And even though we had, for example, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, in reality, the state didn't have to follow that. They could do whatever they wanted, more or less. And we saw this happen across time. Until, one by one, the judicial system decided that it is so fundamental to being an American to have these different rights that they started saying, no, state, you actually do need to follow what this state is doing. For example, in Gideon versus Wainwright, the Supreme Court concluded that having the right to an attorney when you're accused of a crime is so fundamental to being an American that even though the state doesn't require it, the federal government's going to require it of the states. So reading that with the Supremacy Clause means that now if you are accused of a crime in any state and the potential to be incarcerated is on the table, you now qualify for a public defender. The framework that the court used to apply this, so we see this after the Civil War and kind of going forward, is the 14th Amendment. So before the 14th Amendment, there wasn't really this concept of the states needing to follow things. But then after the 14th Amendment, the courts begin to roll this out. And I want to talk just a little bit about what in the 14th Amendment creates this. Because the 14th Amendment, if any of you have looked at it, which I don't require you to do, but if you're curious, you can, is massive. It's typically thought of as like the Civil Rights Amendment. But the phrase that's in there that's really important for this discussion is called the Due Process Clause. And there are actually two due process clauses in the amendments. The first is in the Fifth Amendment, and the second is in the 14th Amendment. We lots of times in a legally way talk about it as procedural versus substantive due process. The Fifth Amendment deals a lot with like criminal convictions. You might have heard this when you're watching TV. I plead the Fifth. That means that somebody is exercising their right to not incriminate themselves. It's only something you can do in a criminal case, and it's only something you can do on your own behalf. You can't just be like, I refuse to answer your questions, I plead the Fifth, if it's like a civil case. Unless it would actually incriminate yourself criminally, then there might be an argument to be made, but then you'd probably lose your civil case, so bad news there. The Due Process Clause that's in the Fifth Amendment is going to deal with how we actually go about obtaining convictions in criminal cases. This is the procedural due process. We have to treat people the same when we are working to put them in jail. What does this mean in practice? Well, if a victim, have you guys heard of show-ups and lineups? A lineup is when they take like 5 people that kind of look the same and put them in a room that's really well lit, and they put the victim behind like some one-way glass, and the victim is like, it's number 3, and identifies the perpetrator of the crime that way. There is a lot of bias towards how those work. They're not super reliable, but you can do things to make it more or less reliable. So if the victim says, hey, this white guy attacked me, and there are 4 black guys and 1 white guy, and he's like, it's clearly number 1, he's the only white guy in the room, that's a problem. Like, that entire thing shouldn't happen. Similarly, if the detective is like, you said it's number 1, are you sure it's not number 3? We're pretty sure it's number 3, you should probably pick 3. That is not procedural due process. That is basically the government putting their finger on the scale trying to get the result they want. That's something that's protected with the Fifth Amendment. On the flip side, the 14th Amendment means that rather than we're going to make sure everybody is going to receive procedural safeguards, or we're going to follow the same path every time, the 14th Amendment deals with how we treat people. It is that substantive due process. We want to make sure that everybody receives the same outcome. I don't know if I'm going to get to it in this book. The prior textbook I use has a big section on the different political philosophies of different countries. Like the Scandinavian countries, for example, is really concerned with equal outcomes. If you're white, if you're black, if you're whatever, you should have the same chance to have the same outcome as anybody else. Meaning that if you put the same level of work in, you should be able to go to the best school. You should be able to get the best job. In the United States, we're more concerned with the concept of equal opportunities, meaning that everybody can apply regardless of what your background is. And at the risk of offending the legislature, so the concept of critical race theory kind of deals with this by talking about how equal opportunities aren't really equal, because people who grow up in different environments have different abilities, they have different skill sets. There's a fantastic book about this that frames it in statistics called Outliers.
Malcolm Gladwell.
Yep, have you read it? If you haven't read it and you're curious about what I'm talking about here, it's fascinating. There's definitely things about race in there, but one of the easiest ways to explain this is that all hockey players, well, most hockey players tend to be born in the winter. And Malcolm Gladwell does a really good job of explaining that it's because they are the biggest when it comes time for hockey season, because they tend to be not old enough yet when their fellow classmates, or when they're small, and then they tend to be big enough once their classmates are relatively smaller than they are. So I'm not doing a good job of explaining this. My son's 6. He started very early in kindergarten because he's born in July. So he's one of the youngest kids in his class. He's not yet, but if he were born, a month earlier in June, he would be one of the biggest kids in his class. He'd have a whole nother year before he'd be eligible to go to kindergarten. He's in first grade now. But what this means from a sports perspective is that the older kids are going to naturally perform better. They're bigger, they've developed more muscle mass, they have more coordination, and as a result, they get more attention when playing hockey. Because they get more attention, they tend to excel at that. They tend to get selected for the better teams and everything. And before you know it, you have a pro hockey player. And I don't remember the statistic, but a vast majority of pros are born at a specific time of the year. This works down in all different avenues of life. So in the United States, we're more focused on letting everybody put their foot in the door. In other countries, they might be focused on making sure that regardless of when you were born, or regardless of the color of your skin, you have the same chance of having the outcome. So the 14th Amendment kind of has the trappings of that, because all of these, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, are a result of slavery and abolishing it. The 13th abolishes it, the 14th guarantees rights, the 15th, I believe, imposes some other limits. I don't know, I don't have those in my notes right now. In practice, does it work 100% of the time? No. But when we start looking at the concept of what it means to be an American, and we start looking at the things that we should enjoy under the Constitution, that's where this due process clause comes into play. Because why should you get a attorney in Florida for a case and not in Georgia? Or you get an attorney in Massachusetts but not in New York. So when the Supreme Court looked at the 14th Amendment, they said, well, this substantive due process, this touchy-feely thing that isn't quite guaranteeing the procedure is the same, means we're going to treat all Americans the same. consequently, this means that a lot of times you have the schools, police, city councils in the heart of these different disputes related to any of your civil liberties. Incorporation is why your local government can violate some of your constitutional rights and not others. All right. When you're thinking about civil liberties, I want you to think about it in 5 steps. The first is to ask the question, is it state action? Is the restriction coming from the government or someone acting like the government? There's a big difference here, because if I slap some police lights on my car and try and pull you over, am I the state government? No. I'm breaking some other laws, but the actions I do aren't constitutionally protected. I don't know if I'm going to talk about Section 1983, but that's the caveat here. If it's purely private action, the constitutional rights usually don't apply. So the question was asked over that way a couple classes ago, whether or not Facebook can censor things. And the answer is, Facebook's a private company. So the Constitution usually isn't going to apply. It's not the government. The second thing I want you to ask is, which right is at issue? Are we talking about speech, religion, search, due process, etc.? Third, what is the government claiming as its goal? This is a big thing, because while you have constitutional protections, there are going to be limits to that. And the government can certainly violate the Constitution for good reasons. You have freedom of speech, but can you yell fire in a crowded movie theater? No. While generally your speech is protected, this would be inciting a riot. It is not something that's protected. And that comes from a line of cases where people would do that, and in several cases it caused stampedes and people got trampled to death. So some of the things you want to consider is this for safety, order, national security, school environment, or something different? This is going to factor in then to what legal test is used when we're looking at these constitutional rights. We're going to keep it pretty simple as we go through this stuff. For speech is, for example, we're going to look at, is the regulation content-based or is it content neutral? Is there a time, place, or manner restriction? And then you're going to apply the test, basically predict the outcome. Not who's right, but whether the rule is likely constitutional or not. So if a public university bans political flyers in all campus buildings, who's acting? Is this state action? And I want everybody to answer, just say yes or no, and I'll kind of say who has it. So who's acting? Is it state action or not? 3, 2, 1.
No. But you want us to say it?
Yeah, I want you to say it. Good job. It is state action because it's a public university. If it were a private university, if we were up at Columbia College, it would not be state action. But because we're at Lincoln University, because it's a public university, this is an arm of the government, and so it is public action. What right are we talking about if you're banning political flyers? I'll give you a hint. We talked a lot about what right we're talking about today. So 3, 2, 1, go. Freedom of speech, excellent. What's the goal of the university banning flyers in campus buildings?
Depends. Are these the same political flyers?
All political flyers.
Censorship of speech?
Censorship? Is that the goal? Like,
it could be like not to entice argument or.
Yeah. Because nobody's like, my goal today is to censor you because I think censoring's fun. Everybody's going to say some reason why they think that what they're doing is justified. In the case of a university banning flyers, I think you're exactly right. This is a place of learning. By all means, we don't want to talk about political issues, right? So you can tell by my sarcasm, I 100% think you guys should be talking about political issues. I highly encourage it. But yeah, the goal that's usually stated is order or safety. And then finally, is this content based or content neutral? Do you guys think that this across the board ban cares about the content of the flyer? No, it's content neutral. So we've kind of gone through those steps. What do you think the outcome is? Do you think the flyers are going to be banned or not?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. I think it's certainly an interesting question. I don't really know the answer to it. I could see it going both ways. But, you know, that's the cool thing about this is lots of times there is no right or wrong answer. It's all about you guys approaching the framework and looking at systematically what you think the answer is. All right, let's dive a little deeper into free speech. So the core principle of freedom of speech is political speech is at the heart of the First Amendment. Our founding fathers thought it was really important for people to be able to get together and share their ideas. Because if you don't think the government is working correctly, you ought to be able to talk about it. And guys, I want to emphasize how big of an idea this is becoming at the moment. Because we are seeing an attack on freedom of speech like we have never seen before. Did anybody watch the Grammys?
Yes.
Yeah. What happened at the Grammys that's causing all this trouble?
Well, I know Bad Bunny and some other, and the host, I forgot his name. Yeah, they were like speaking out against, I think it was ICE, and just basically saying how it's terrible speaking out against the current president.
Yeah. So the host, and I don't remember his name, he's a comedian, said something along the lines of, the Epstein files have been released. Now I understand why Donald Trump is so obsessed with acquiring Greenland. He needs a new island to hang out on with Bill Clinton. And so Donald Trump immediately took to Twitter and threatened to sue him for billions of dollars, basically, claiming defamation. A very unlikely case for Donald Trump to win, but this has happened several times. CBS has been sued. Jimmy Kimmel was taken off the air for a little while. Colbert
is completely off.
Yeah. The BBC has been sued by Donald Trump for a documentary they had. This sort of thing is what is normally protected. You are usually allowed to almost across the board joke about political people without having to worry about it. So,
People getting fired for talking about a certain someone.
what?
Getting fired for talking about someone.
Yeah.
Said they didn't like them.
Yeah, like now, you know, the interesting thing here is that there are some limits here. So I want to walk this back just a little bit, because if you work for like the Attorney General and you're like, I effing hate the Attorney General, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get fired, and there's a pretty good chance that's going to be okay.
I'm talking about.
But
Should I say it?
sure.
A lot of people I have family members that like worked at Amazon that got fired for simply saying they didn't like Charlie Kirk.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Well, I was going to say, that is the other caveat here is, remember, your freedom of speech applies to the government.
yeah, so the company can do what they want, I guess.
Yeah. And it's a chilling thing to think that, you know, we are now policing the ideas that people exchange. And there's a whole like discussion about post-consumerism and everything that factors in here that I'm not going to bore you guys with, but it's a little spooky to those of us who are watching it, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's the core principle. There's two big categories of speech you guys need to understand. You know, I've hinted at this with our example. Number one is content-based restrictions. So the government targets what is being said, generally treated as highly suspicious. So if the government's going after somebody because they told jokes about the president, that is going to be highly suspicious. If they're going after somebody because they're publishing pornography or like naked pictures in textbooks that are available to children, that is going to pass a test called strict scrutiny. So even though that's content specific, it's going to be allowed for the government to regulate that. And we'll talk about the different tests in a couple of minutes. But I want to throw that caveat out here right now. That normally content-based restrictions are going to be suspect. Sometimes that's still going to pass the test. So content-neutral restrictions, the government regulates time, place, or manner. This can be allowed if it leaves reasonable alternatives and serves legitimate goals. In a case I'm familiar with dealing with the political flyer thing, not cool to say that across the campus we can't have any political flyers. Cool to say no political flyers in any of the buildings except for the central bulletin board that we have flyers on. So they created a reasonable alternative to the prohibition on it. There's different types of speech. There's symbolic speech. This can be protected. Burning the flag, for example. There's commercial speech, which gets less protection. Answer of commercial speech is like, these are the best headphones in the universe. They sound better than anything. Is that going to be okay? Well, with what I just said, yes, because I have made bolsterous claims. But if I were to say something like, these are guaranteed to improve your hearing, that's not something I can say. That's not going to be protected speech because I'm trying to sell you some headphones, so I can't lie about their capabilities. There are some narrow historical categories of speech that get less protected, but we're not really going to go into those very much. So the hardest speech cases aren't about nice speech. They're about whether the government can control ideas. We're going to skip this. I've been hinting about this for all of class, so I want to give it to you. I think it's probably later in my notes to do, but I want to give it to you now. When the government creates a law that violates one of your constitutional rights, we talked about how that's going to be okay in some circumstances. We're going to run it through different tests depending on what the right is. And there are basically three. There's the reasonable basis test, intermediate scrutiny, and strict scrutiny. So if it's something that is dealing with like a something that's not protected by the Constitution or something that's not a suspect class, we're going to have this reasonable basis test. We can think of it in terms of like me saying as a university professor, you have to turn your homework in. If you don't, I'm going to fail you. Is this something that is going to be permitted? Is this a rule that you have to follow? The answer is absolutely. Is there a reasonable basis for what I as a government actor are doing by requiring you to turn in your homework? Yeah, I'm teaching my class. That's the whole reason you're here. And because of that, as long as there's a reasonable basis, I can pretty much do whatever I want. Strict scrutiny, on the other end of the spectrum, comes into play when we're talking about things that are either constitutionally protected or there is a suspect class. So if we have a rule that says something like, in order to be a firefighter, you have to be white, is that something that's going to stand up to strict scrutiny? Well, let's run it through the test. The first question is, does the government have a significant interest in what we're doing or what they're trying to control?
I would say yes.
Maybe. You have to look at what the motivation is. when we get to intermittent scrutiny, this will make a lot more sense. But what would the purpose of saying firefighters have to be a specific race be?
It would just to prohibit other races from being able to be in that same position.
Yeah.
Civil rights violation?
Well, it becomes a civil rights violation today, but exactly, if the goal is to prevent other races from being in that position, and that is probably the only rational goal that exists by trying to segregate something like fighting fires, well, that's going to fail that first prong of the strict scrutiny test. So do they have a compelling interest? Not really. This isn't something that makes you think, oh my God, we definitely need to protect this. And then the second prong is the regulation narrowly tailored to be as permissive as possible? The answer is no. If we take disabilities, another protected class example, and we say that in order to be a pilot of a commercial airplane, you have to have vision better than 20/40. What's the government's interest here? So that they don't have planes falling out of the sky, right? Preservation of life. Is that a compelling interest? I would argue absolutely. And is it narrowly tailored to prevent or to allow the most flexibility here? Yeah, like saying that you've got to have at least 20/30 vision is probably going to be narrowly tailored there. 20/30 is pretty close to normal. Now, intermediate scrutiny deals with quasi-suspect classes. So if we segregate people on based on gender, that's going to be quasi-suspect, meaning that women versus men, neither one of them is actually protected. It's not like a disability where they need people to stand up for them because they make up about 50% of the population. I think it's skewed towards women a little bit. But it doesn't really sound nice if we say things like firefighters have to be men. This also goes to things that have a disparate impact. A disparate impact is when a requirement tends to favor one side versus the other. So if we were to say that you have to be able to bench press 200 pounds in order to be a firefighter, there are more men who can probably bench press 200 pounds than there are women. This has a disparate impact. It's not actually saying that women can't be firefighters, but it has that effect. And so the question becomes, is this something that's going to be allowed? With the intermittent law, come on, Andrew. With the intermediate scrutiny, the government must show an important interest. What would the government's interest in saying, for example, that you have to be able to bench press 200 pounds be when we're talking about firefighters?
Like picking up heavy debris.
Picking up heavy debris. I weigh like 220, 230. I want some firefighter to be able to carry me out of a building if it's burning down and I've lost consciousness, right? The government has determined that part of doing that job is being able to lift heavy weights. Is that an important interest? Do we want our firefighters to be able to save lives? Yeah. So now the law must be substantially related to achieving the goal. If we are to say that women can't be firefighters, that's not substantially related, because lots of women probably can bench press 200 pounds. And so to say that women can't do it because we've just decided that it's important to be a man because they can perform better, that's not going to be substantially related. But if we say that you have this lifting requirement, that is substantially related to the task at hand. Real quick, I want to go over the triggers one more time. So the triggers for rational basis, these are most laws. This is the default level. With intermediate scrutiny, this is things like sex, gender, classification, and some other contexts. And then strict scrutiny is race classifications, many content-based speech restrictions, and some fundamental right contexts. The government's, and again for strict scrutiny, because that's the hardest one. You're looking for a compelling government interest and narrowly tailored. This is the highest bar that exists. All right, we've got about 7 minutes left. We've covered a ton of territory. What questions do you guys have? Shoot.
Okay, so when a piece of media is like spread on a social media platform, for example, if you said Facebook is like a private, I think it was domain or private company. Let's say that one of the users is like spreading a bunch of hateful stuff in a company and doesn't get to it in a certain amount of time. Does the government then have the power to override that and then like send a message to that company to be like, hey, you have to take down this hateful speech? Or then again, does it just still belong in the hands of the company since it's private?
This is such a complicated question. So let's address the government action component to begin with. The government doesn't probably have the ability, if it's hateful speech, to say, Facebook, take it down. They could say, Facebook, please take it down. They could ask, but they can't compel. If it's endangering national security, they can probably act and say, you got to take this down under this law because it's important to our self-defense or something. But they can't remove like hateful speech just because. Now, the fascinating thing here, and what makes this really complicated, is the difference between online media and print media. Because if People magazine, for example, were to publish hateful things or defamatory things. Defamatory is when you make malicious, false statements about another person. If People magazine were to publish defamatory things or to allow people to send things in that then they turned around and published regardless of what it said, they would be on the hook for defamation. So the person who was defamed could sue the magazine to basically get money from People magazine for the damage there. Now what makes this really complicated is to keep the internet a place where free ideas are exchanged. Service providers and internet platforms typically do not have a requirement to moderate their content. Now there's been some news in the media where federally they're trying to change that. But basically what this means is that Facebook isn't responsible for the stuff you put up there. Facebook might care because they want to build a community where people can come together, but Facebook isn't going to be able to be sued for defamation because somebody put up hate speech or something like that. Like I said, this is an issue out there right now. I don't think we've heard the end of it. We haven't heard much about it this year. We heard a lot about it last year, but they want to get rid of that. And I want you to think about the consequences of doing that. The internet doesn't work like, you drive your car to Burger King and get a burger. It's not like your computer goes out and connects directly to Facebook and reads Facebook stuff. There's a whole bunch of different computers that your computer goes through. You get on the internet and you connect to your internet service provider's local node, which goes to a regional office, which goes to like a national office, which then shoots out to some distribution network and then goes down the chain through other internet service providers to finally get to Facebook. There might be 20, 30 machines there. If all of a sudden we get rid of the concept of not having to moderate stuff on the internet, then all of a sudden your internet service provider cares about what's written on Facebook. Facebook cares about what's written on Facebook. All those intermediate steps care about it. And that might have a chilling effect on the free exchange of ideas. Because if you imagine that everybody's applying different standards to that, then we get to a situation where maybe nothing's on the internet at all, right? Except for cat videos.
Kind of reminds me of like how I think it's North Korea and how their government, or like certain governments, only have certain things shown on their media. Out in so.
Yeah. And that becomes the thing, like, do we want to get to a place where people have to get their content like pre-approved, or that there's strict ways that information has to be distributed?
Well, that's hard too with AI.
Yeah.
How are we gonna know something's AI or not? You can use an AI to check if it's AI, but they're not always
And
correct.
I would say until you can't,
Yeah.
because right now the AI will detect itself, but we are quickly getting to a place where
Well, AI writing can't detect itself. The images will be matched. They won't be able to detect themselves.
exactly.
I mean, there's fake videos of trees exploding from the cold, which is an incredibly rare phenomenon. It doesn't happen all the time, but fake videos get views. It's a fake video of something else. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, and you guys are going to start thinking I'm obsessed with pornography or something, but that's where a lot of the discussion lies.
The grok.
I was going to say, right now, Grok is undressing people, and
The actor that plays Holly in Stranger Things, she's like 12 or something.
yeah. I keep saying this, but may we be cursed to live in interesting times. Other questions?
Can I have one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
I kind of like think back to like how, people back in the day were like being blacklisted for saying things or something like that. I wonder if like social media companies could kind of do something similar to that. If a celebrity was again saying something horrendous, they could kind of like, I guess, shadow them, which I guess in some instances, they get banned from the app or taken away, or lose some of the profits from companies and stuff that they work with. So I was just thinking.
Well, they did, and there was a massive pushback on all of that. I mean, Elon Musk acquired the company formerly known as Twitter, rebranded it to X, because it began policing the content. And specifically during COVID, a lot of conservative-leaning individuals posted factually inaccurate information, including the president. And so as a result, Twitter suspended, banned, removed content, and the right got all kinds of angry about it because they deemed it as censoring them, not censoring the inaccurate information, but censoring their platform. And there's a lot of political pushback to organizations doing that, and we saw shortly after Donald Trump was elected to his second term, a lot of companies either completely rolling back or removing their moderation guidelines. So Facebook, for example, had some pretty robust moderation stuff that they removed when the president took office. So, yes, but the pushback to that was calling it cancel culture and saying that people shouldn't be canceled for expressing their viewpoint. And I think it, to a large extent, comes down to what community do you want to live in, right? And this is a question companies have to ask themselves. Does Facebook want to be a community where hate and violence and everything is spread, or does Facebook want to be a place where people have to engage civilly? They've made their choice, but your question of can organizations blacklist people, can organizations fight back, basically? Yeah, 100%. But what we have seen is a chilling effect, and they aren't doing that as much as they used to. Does that address your question here?
Yes, it does.
All right.
I don't know if this is slightly unrelated, but I logged into a game that I play. It's called Splatoon, if anyone knows that. And Splatoon 3 still has message boards where people can draw stuff. I log in, I haven't played it in a long time, and every little character, they have little speech bubbles where people can draw stuff. It all says, "I hate ice." And it's just surreal. like in that little game, they used to be like little drawings of the little stick figures and stuff, because a lot of kids play it, but it just says abolish ICE everywhere. It's just surreal walking through this internet little video game for teens and kids that just has like protest material all over it.
There's a really good Atlantic article about Roblox that talks about how. Does anybody play Roblox? My my younger siblings do, and the content we're serving kids is insane. Like,
No, Roblox is like completely uncensored. They don't.
yeah, and but it's almost like the corporate greed is kind of the thing that gets me. There is a I'm not really entirely sure how Roblox works, but there's a Victoria's Secret store, for example, that you can, like, I guess go into that sub app and buy things for your character. And it's like, I don't think my, like, 6-year-old needs to be playing a game where he can go buy some lingerie. I don't really know if you can buy lingerie specifically, but things like that get a little strange, because it's not designed to sexualize people or anything. It is designed to be brand placement and to get people to be like, oh, in the real world, I want to go do this. It's happened everywhere. Like, if you watch movies as far back as like the 60s, there's product placement.
There's always like a big can of soda on the table and they hover over the Coca-Cola label.
Yeah, exactly. But it's getting really bad when we start targeting children. All right, I've kept you guys. Well, nope. We have like 1 more minute. Anybody else with questions?
Just want to say, a lot of the issue with Roblox is
I got class at 9. So I'm going to class at 8.
Oh, I have kept you over. I'm sorry. If you have, I'll answer your question in a minute. But if you have not gotten attendance, come up here.